Hey there, dear ones. Go ahead and settle in now. Find that comfortable spot, the one where your body just sinks into the mattress. Dim those lights. Let them fade down low, just a soft glow, or maybe no light at all. That's right. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears. Unclench your jaw. Just breathe. Long, slow breaths. In and out. Perfect. Welcome. I'm so glad you're here with me tonight. I've been thinking about you, you know. Thinking about all the noise of your day, all the rushing and the worry. But that's done now. That's all behind you. Right now, there's just this moment, just my voice, and a story. A long, gentle story about people who lived hundreds of years ago, in castles and manor houses, in stone chambers lit by candlelight. Tonight, we're going to talk about queens. Medieval queens. And their companions, their rivals, the royal mistresses who lived in the shadows and sometimes in the light. But this isn't a story of battles and bloodshed. No, no. This is about the quiet moments. The daily rhythms. The embroidery by the window. The letters written in careful script. The cold stone floors and the warm furs. The waiting. So much waiting. Close your eyes now. Let them rest. And let me take you back through the centuries, to a time when life moved slowly, when a letter could take weeks to arrive, when winter meant months of stillness and summer meant the king might finally come home. Let's begin. Imagine a woman waking in a castle bedchamber. It's still dark outside. The thick tapestries on the walls move just slightly in the draft that comes from somewhere, always from somewhere. Stone buildings are never truly still, never truly warm, no matter how many fires you light. She lies there for a moment, under layers of wool blankets and furs, and she can see her breath in the air. A pale mist in the pre-dawn darkness. This is Eleanor of Aquitaine, and it is the year 1152, and she has just married Henry Plantagenet, who will soon be King of England. But right now, in this moment, she is simply a woman waking up in a cold room. Her ladies-in-waiting sleep in the outer chamber. She can hear one of them snoring softly. It's a comforting sound, actually. A human sound in all this stone and silence. Eleanor is 30 years old. She has already been a queen once before, married to Louis VII of France. That marriage was annulled just weeks ago, and people whispered about it, of course. They said she was too independent, too willful. They said she had accompanied Louis on crusade and that such behavior was unseemly for a woman. They said many things. Eleanor learned early that people would always say things, and there was very little point in worrying about it. She rises slowly, and immediately her ladies appear, as if summoned by the simple act of her feet touching the floor. They bring her a chemise, long and soft, made of linen. Then layer after layer. A gown of deep blue wool. A surcoat. A belt of woven silk and gold thread that sits low on her hips. The dressing takes a long time. Everything takes a long time in this era. There is no rushing. Rushing would be undignified, and besides, where would you rush to? Her hair is braided, long plaits wound around her head and covered with a silk veil and then a circlet of gold. The weight of it is familiar now, though she remembers when she first wore such things, how heavy they seemed, how her neck ached. Now it's just part of being who she is. Breakfast is bread and ale, sometimes a bit of cheese or cold meat left from the night before. She eats in her chamber, sitting near the window where the light is just beginning to creep in, grey and soft. From here she can see the courtyard below, already busy with servants and stable boys and all the endless work of keeping a great household running. Eleanor brought with her from Aquitaine a taste for poetry, for music, for the culture of the southern lands where the sun is warmer and the people laugh more easily. She will spend much of her morning listening to accounts from her stewards, because she is not just a decorative queen. She holds lands in her own right, vast territories in southern France, and she manages them herself. There are disputes to settle, rents to collect, grants to approve. A man comes before her, hat in hand, to complain that his neighbor's pigs have been rooting in his turnip field. Eleanor listens carefully. She asks questions. What kind of fence does he have? When did this begin? Has he spoken to the neighbor? The man answers, nervous before this great lady, but she is patient. She always is, when it comes to these matters. In the end, she decrees that the neighbor must pay for the damaged turnips and repair the fence. Both men bow and leave, and the next petitioner enters. This goes on for hours. It is not dramatic. It is simply the work of governance, the slow turning of the machinery that keeps people fed and housed and more or less at peace with one another. Eleanor signs documents, her signature careful and practiced. She applies her seal to letters. She dictates messages to her scribes. And then, in the afternoon, she embroiders. This surprises some people, that a woman so powerful, so educated, would spend hours with a needle and thread. But embroidery is not simply decoration. It is storytelling. It is art. And it is also one of the few things a woman can do with her hands while her mind works on other problems. The needle goes in and out, forming patterns of leaves and vines and tiny birds, and while she works, she thinks. She plans. She remembers. She thinks about her children. She has 2 daughters from her first marriage, and she will have 8 children with Henry. 8. She will spend years of her life pregnant, years recovering, years nursing infants and watching them grow. Some will die young, as children did in those days, more often than not. Some will survive and bring her great joy and great sorrow, sometimes both at once. But tonight, we're not thinking about the sorrows. Tonight, we're thinking about the quiet afternoons, the way the light slants through the narrow windows, the way the thread catches the sun and glimmers for just a moment before disappearing into the fabric. Let me tell you about another queen, one who lived a bit earlier, in a different land. Her name was Matilda of Flanders, and she was the wife of William the Conqueror. Now, William is remembered for invading England in 1066, for the Battle of Hastings, for all that violence and upheaval. But Matilda, she stayed in Normandy most of the time. She ruled there while William was off conquering. Matilda was a small woman, they say. Barely 5 feet tall. Her bones were examined by archaeologists centuries later, and they confirmed it. A tiny woman, and yet she held power in an age of tall men in armor. She did it through careful management, through alliance, through never losing her temper in public, through writing letters in her neat hand and making sure the right people received the right gifts at the right times. She had 9 children. 9. Imagine that. Imagine carrying 9 children in that small body, in an age when childbirth was one of the most dangerous things a woman could face. But Matilda survived all 9, and most of the children survived too, which was unusual and lucky. She spent her days much like Eleanor would, a century later. There is a sameness to the lives of queens, across the years. They wake in cold chambers. They dress with help. They attend Mass, always Mass, in the castle chapel where the stones are even colder and the incense hangs in the air and the priest's voice echoes. They listen to petitions. They manage estates. They embroider. They write letters. Matilda commissioned the Bayeux Tapestry. Well, probably. Historians argue about it, but the most common belief is that she ordered it made, this enormous embroidered chronicle of her husband's conquest. It took years to complete. Teams of women working with colored wools, creating scenes of ships and horses and men with spears and arrows. 70 meters long, this tapestry. Imagine the hours. Imagine sitting in a workshop, your fingers flying, creating a tiny horse's leg, a soldier's face, a border of strange beasts and birds. The women who did this work, we don't know their names. We never do. History remembers the queens sometimes, if they're lucky. But the ladies in waiting, the embroiderers, the servants, the women who spent their whole lives in the service of great households, they're mostly shadows. We know they existed because someone had to do the work. Someone had to make the tapestries and the clothes and the sheets. Someone had to nurse the babies and tend the sick and prepare the bodies of the dead for burial. Let me tell you about a different kind of woman now. Not a queen by marriage, but a woman who held power nonetheless. Alice Perez. She was the mistress of King Edward III of England, and she lived in the 14th century, and her story is a quieter one than you might expect. Alice came from nowhere, really. Minor gentry at best. She entered the Queen's household as a lady-in-waiting when she was very young, maybe 13 or 14. This was common. Girls were sent to great households to learn manners, to make connections, to find husbands. Alice was clever and beautiful, and Edward noticed her. Queen Philippa was still alive when the affair began, and this is one of those complicated human things. Philippa knew. Of course she knew. Everyone knew. But Philippa was ill by then, worn down by years of childbearing. She had 13 children, and by a life spent following her husband on campaign, living in drafty tents and requisitioned manor houses, always moving, always waiting. She was tired. And perhaps she was even a little grateful that someone else was there to manage the king's moods, to keep him happy. Alice was given rooms in the palace. She was given gifts. Land, jewels, money. She became wealthy. And she was smart about it. She didn't just accept the gifts and spend them on frivolity. She invested. She bought property. She made loans. By the time Edward died, Alice was one of the richest women in England. But what was her daily life like? That's what we care about tonight. The everyday texture of existence. She woke, like all women of her station, in a bed with curtains. These bed curtains were essential. They kept out drafts, kept in warmth, gave you a small private space in a world where privacy was rare. She would lie there for a moment, listening to the sounds of the palace waking up. Footsteps in the corridor. Voices. The clatter of someone dropping something in a distant kitchen. Her maids would come. They would bring water for washing, heated if she was lucky, cool if the fires hadn't been lit early enough. She would wash her face and hands. That was usually it. Full baths were rare, maybe once a month, maybe less. People used linen cloths to wipe themselves down, and they changed their undergarments regularly. They weren't as dirty as we sometimes imagine, medieval people. They just had different ideas about cleanliness. Alice would dress in fine wool gowns, dyed beautiful colors. Blue was expensive, a good deep blue. Red was expensive too. Her gowns would have tight sleeves and flowing skirts and trains that whispered on the stone floors. She would wear a wimple or a veil, some head covering, because respectable women covered their hair. Even mistresses. Especially mistresses, who had to work harder to maintain respectability. She would attend Mass. Always Mass. Religion wasn't optional. It was the framework of life, the way you marked the hours and the days. Matins, Lauds, Prime, Terce, Sext, None, Vespers, Compline. The canonical hours. Bells ringing. Prayers spoken. Even if you weren't in church for all of them, you heard the bells. You knew what time it was by which prayer was being said. After Mass, Alice would go to the king. Edward was old by now, in his 60s, and he was declining. He had been a great warrior once, a man who won battles and inspired loyalty. But age comes for everyone. He was forgetful. He was irritable. He needed Alice to manage things for him, to soothe him, to make sure he ate and slept. She would sit with him. They might play chess. They might just talk, or rather, she would talk and he would listen, or pretend to. She would tell him about the household, about who needed what, about the small dramas that filled the days. Lord So-and-so's daughter was getting married. The cook had burned the pies. Someone's favorite dog had died. These tiny details, this is what life is made of. Not the great events, but the daily accumulation of small moments. Alice would dine at the king's table, a position of great honor and great scrutiny. Everyone watched her. Everyone judged. She had to eat delicately, speak carefully, never drink too much wine, never laugh too loudly. She had to be perfect, or as close to perfect as a human can manage, because the moment she slipped, the moment she made a mistake, her enemies would pounce. And she had enemies. Of course she did. A woman in her position always has enemies. The king's sons resented her influence. The nobles thought she was grasping and greedy. The church disapproved of her very existence. But Alice survived by being useful, by being indispensable, by knowing more and working harder than anyone expected. In the evenings, she would retire to her chambers. She would read, if there was enough light. Books were precious things, hand-copied, expensive. Maybe she read romances, stories of King Arthur and his knights, of courtly love and quests and magic. Or maybe she read religious texts, prayers and meditations, the lives of saints. Both were common. Or she would embroider, like all the women we've talked about. That steady, meditative work. The needle, the thread, the fabric stretched on a frame. Making something beautiful, stitch by tiny stitch. And then, to bed. The curtains drawn. The world shut out. Sleep coming slowly or quickly, depending on the worries of the day. Let me tell you about another woman. Agnès Sorel. She was the mistress of Charles VII of France in the 15th century, and she was the first royal mistress to be officially acknowledged. Before her, these relationships existed, but they were discreet, hidden, spoken of in whispers. Agnès changed that. She was beautiful. The chroniclers all agree on this. Fair-haired, pale-skinned, with the kind of beauty that made artists want to paint her. And they did. She was painted as the Virgin Mary, as saints, as allegorical figures. This was scandalous, a mistress posing as the Mother of God, but Agnès didn't seem to care much about scandal. She wore gowns that were considered daring. Low necklines. Fitted bodices. She set fashions that other women followed, even though they tutted and gossiped about her while they copied her style. She wore jewels, not just pretty baubles but serious gemstones. Diamonds. Rubies. Emeralds the size of quail eggs. Charles gave her estates. He gave her a chateau, the Chateau de Luche, where she could live in comfort and style. She bore him 4 daughters, all of whom Charles acknowledged and provided for. But what did she do all day, this beautiful, scandalous woman? She woke in silk sheets, a luxury that most people never experienced. Silk from the East, brought over trade routes that stretched thousands of miles. She had furs, too. Ermine and marten and fox. Her chambers were hung with tapestries that kept out some of the cold and made the stone walls a little less harsh. Agnès took her breakfast privately, usually. Bread and wine, maybe some fruit if it was in season. Apples stored from autumn. Pears. Grapes in late summer. She would eat slowly, thinking about her day. She had influence, real political influence. Charles listened to her. She advocated for certain nobles, certain policies. She encouraged him to drive the English out of France, to reclaim his kingdom. Some historians think she was one of the reasons Charles finally bestirred himself to act, after years of indecision. A beautiful woman whispering in your ear can be very persuasive. But politics was only part of her day. She also managed her household, which was large. She had ladies-in-waiting, maids, cooks, stewards, grooms, guards. All these people looked to her for direction. She had to make sure they were paid, fed, housed. She had to settle their disputes. She had to hire new servants when old ones left or died. She had to order supplies. How much wine for the month? How much grain? How many candles? Candles were expensive. Tallow candles, made from animal fat, were cheaper but smelled terrible when they burned. Beeswax candles were much nicer, clean-burning and sweet-smelling, but they cost significantly more. A great household would use hundreds of candles a month, thousands a year. Someone had to keep track. Agnès would spend time on her appearance, because that was part of her role. Her hair would be washed and brushed and arranged. This took hours, sometimes. Her maids would use special combs, bone or ivory, to work through the tangles. They might use scented oils or herbal rinses to make her hair shine and smell pleasant. Her gowns had to be chosen carefully. What message was she sending today? Rich fabrics and bright colors showed wealth and confidence. Simpler gowns showed modesty and piety. She had to balance. Too much display and people called her vain and grasping. Too little and they said she was losing her looks, losing her power. She would visit Charles, of course. Spend time with him. Make him laugh. Distract him from his worries. Kings carried enormous burdens, and sometimes they just needed to forget for a few hours. Agnes provided that forgetfulness. They would talk. They would play cards or dice. They would walk in the gardens when the weather was good. Gardens in medieval times were different from modern ones. Smaller, more enclosed. Raised beds with herbs and flowers. Roses, always roses. Lilies. Violets. The scent of rosemary and lavender. Gravel paths that crunched underfoot. Maybe a fountain, if the household was wealthy enough. The sound of water, trickling and splashing, a peaceful counterpoint to the business of the castle. Agnes would dine well. The king's table was laden with dishes. Roasted meats, venison and boar and swan. Fish on fast days, prepared in 100 different ways. Pies filled with fruits or meats or both together. Jellies and custards. Spiced wine. Hippocras, they called it, wine mixed with honey and spices like cinnamon and ginger. It was served warm in winter, cool in summer. But even at these feasts, there was a certain formality. You didn't just grab food with your hands, though you did eat with your fingers since forks weren't common yet. You had a trencher, a thick slice of bread that served as a plate. You had a knife for cutting. You shared a cup with your neighbor. You washed your hands before and after eating. Manners mattered. In the evenings, there might be entertainment. Musicians playing soft melodies on lutes and viols. Singers performing ballads. Maybe a storyteller, recounting tales of Roland or Charlemagne or the fall of Troy. Agnes would sit and listen, her hands busy with embroidery or just folded in her lap, and the hours would pass in this gentle, repetitive way. She died young, Agnes. Only 28. Childbirth, probably, though some said poison. There were always rumors of poison when someone important died suddenly. Her death was mourned by Charles, genuinely mourned. He never took another official mistress. He gave her a proper funeral, had masses said for her soul. And for a while, people spoke of her kindly, remembering her beauty and her grace. But time moved on, as it always does. Let me tell you now about a queen who lived in a different kind of captivity. Isabeau of Bavaria. She married Charles VI of France in 1385, when she was just 14 years old. Charles was 15. They were children, really, playing at being king and queen. For a few years, it was almost like a fairy tale. Charles was handsome and charming. Isabeau was pretty and sweet-natured. They had children quickly, one after another. They seemed happy. But then Charles went mad. It happened suddenly, during a military campaign. He had a fit of some kind, attacked his own men, and from that day on, his sanity was fragile. He would have periods of lucidity and periods of complete disconnection from reality. Sometimes he didn't recognize Isabeau. Sometimes he thought he was made of glass and would shatter if touched. Imagine being Isabeau. Imagine being 20 years old with several young children and a husband who no longer knows who you are. Who might be violent, who might be catatonic, who might be perfectly normal for weeks and then suddenly, terrifyingly absent. She had to carry on. Someone had to rule France. So Isabeau stepped in. She attended council meetings. She signed documents. She negotiated with nobles who resented taking orders from a woman. She tried to hold the kingdom together while her husband raved in a locked room or sat silent and staring for hours. Her daily life became a strange split. Part of it was the normal routine of a queen. Waking, dressing, attending mass, managing the household. But part of it was this constant vigilance. Is Charles well today? Can he receive visitors? Should we pretend he's simply unwell, or has it gone beyond pretense? Isabeau had 15 children, though many died young. 15. Imagine the toll that took on her body, her spirit. Pregnancy after pregnancy, in an age when childbirth could kill you, when infant mortality was so high that you learned not to become too attached too quickly. She found comfort where she could. She was accused of taking lovers, and maybe she did. Who could blame her? Her husband was mad. She was young and lonely and carrying impossible burdens. Whether the accusations were true or just malicious gossip spread by her enemies, we'll never know. History is full of these uncertainties, these gaps we can't fill. What we do know is that she kept going. She got up every morning, put on her crown, and did the work. She negotiated with England, trying to end the 100 Years' War. She navigated the feuds between the Dukes of Burgundy and Orleans. She survived plots and scandals and the contempt of chroniclers who thought a woman had no business in politics. Her chambers would have been fine but not joyful. Rich tapestries, yes, and good furniture, but there's a difference between a room that's well appointed and a room that feels like home. Isabeau's rooms probably felt like the office of someone who never quite gets to leave work. She would have papers everywhere. Letters to read, documents to sign. Messengers arriving at all hours with news from the provinces, from the border, from the king's sickroom. She would have to make decisions constantly. Should we send troops here? Should we agree to this treaty? Should we replace this official who seems to be embezzling? And through it all, the daily rituals. Mass in the morning. Meals taken at the proper times. Dressing and undressing with the help of her ladies. The surface of normalcy maintained even as everything underneath was chaos. She would embroider, probably. It's what women did. The repetitive motion, the slow creation of beauty, it must have been soothing. A way to quiet the mind, to stop thinking for just a little while about all the problems that had no good solutions. Isabeau lived a long time, into her 60s, which was unusual for the era. She outlived her mad husband. She outlived most of her children. By the end, she was living quietly, in retirement, forgotten by most people. The girl who had arrived in France as a teenage bride, who had ruled a kingdom, who had survived so much, she just faded away into obscurity. It's a melancholy story, in some ways. But there's also something peaceful about that ending. After all the struggle, all the noise, she got to be quiet. Let me tell you about a different kind of royal woman now. Jacquetta of Luxembourg. She was the mother of Elizabeth Woodville, who would become Queen of England, but before that, Jacquetta had her own interesting life. She was married very young, as most noble women were, to the Duke of Bedford. He was much older, and he died after just a few years of marriage, leaving Jacquetta a wealthy widow at age 19. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Jacquetta fell in love with one of her husband's knights, a man named Richard Woodville. He was handsome but relatively poor, far below her in social status. She should have married another great lord, made another political alliance. Instead, she married Richard in secret. This caused a scandal. The king was furious. Jacquetta had to pay a fine. But she didn't care. She had married for love, a rare and precious thing in an age of arranged marriages and political maneuvering. They had 14 children together. 14. And Jacquetta raised them in relative obscurity for years, living on her husband's modest estates, managing a household that was genteel but not grand. What was her life like during those years? Quieter than it had been when she was a duchess. She woke in a manor house, not a palace. The rooms were smaller. The household was smaller. She probably did more of the work herself, or at least supervised it more closely. She would have taught her daughters to sew, to read, to manage a household. She would have taught her sons to ride and fight and behave like gentlemen. Education happened at home, mostly. A chaplain might teach the children their letters and numbers. Jacquetta herself would teach them manners, deportment, all the subtle skills of navigating society. She gardened, probably. Many noblewomen did. Not hard labor, there were servants for that, but planning the gardens, choosing what to plant, taking cuttings, tending the roses. It was considered a genteel occupation, suitable for ladies. And there's something deeply satisfying about making things grow, about putting a seed in the ground and watching it become a flower or a fruit. Jacquetta's life changed dramatically when her daughter Elizabeth caught the eye of King Edward IV and became queen. Suddenly Jacquetta was the king's mother-in-law, a person of great importance. She moved back into the world of palaces and politics. But I like to think about those quiet years in between. The years when she was just a woman who had married for love, raising her children, managing her household, living a life that was small but full. Those years get lost in the historical record, overshadowed by what came later. But they mattered. They shaped who she was. In the mornings, she would have checked on the stillroom, where medicines and cosmetics were made. Noblewomen were expected to know basic medicine. They made salves for wounds, tinctures for fevers, syrups for coughs. They grew the herbs themselves, often. Chamomile for sleep. Feverfew for headaches. Comfrey for bruises. Lavender for almost everything. The stillroom would smell amazing. All those herbs drying in bunches hung from the ceiling. Bottles and jars lined up on shelves. A mortar and pestle for grinding. A small fire for heating and distilling. Jacquetta would have spent hours here, learning recipes from older women, teaching them to her daughters, creating remedies for her family and servants. This was important work. Doctors were expensive and often far away. If someone got sick, you dealt with it yourself. You made a poultice or a tea. You sat by the sickbed and prayed. You did what you could. Jacquetta was accused of witchcraft later in life. This was a common accusation against women who were too successful, too influential, too difficult to control. The charge was ridiculous and didn't stick, but it tells you something about how she was perceived. A woman who had married beneath her for love, who had raised her daughter to be queen, who knew about herbs and healing, she was suspect. Dangerous. Unnatural. But in her own mind, she was probably just a woman doing her best. Getting up each day. Taking care of her family. Finding small pleasures where she could. Let me tell you about another mistress now. Diane de Poitiers. She lived in the 16th century, and she was the mistress of Henri II of France. What makes her story unusual is that she was 20 years older than Henri. When he fell in love with her, he was a teenager and she was a widow in her 30s. And yet, she held his devotion for decades. She was intelligent, cultured, beautiful. She took care of her appearance meticulously. She bathed regularly in cold water, which was thought to preserve youth. She rode horses for exercise. She ate carefully. And it worked. By all accounts, she looked remarkable even as she aged. Diane's daily routine was disciplined. She woke early, always. Early rising was considered virtuous. She would pray, bathe, and then ride. She loved riding, loved being on horseback in the fresh air. She would ride for an hour or more, through forests and fields, her hair streaming behind her. Then she would break her fast with a simple meal. Bread, maybe some eggs. She didn't eat heavily in the morning. She would spend the rest of the morning reading or attending to correspondence. Diane was well educated. She read Latin, which was unusual even for noblewomen. She collected books, beautiful illuminated manuscripts that were works of art in themselves. She would visit Henri, of course. He was devoted to her. He gave her jewels, estates, money. He consulted her on political matters. His wife, Catherine de' Medici, was sidelined in favor of Diane. This must have been humiliating for Catherine, but she endured it. What choice did she have? Divorce wasn't an option. She had to stay, had to produce heirs, had to watch her husband lavish attention on another woman. Diane handled her position with grace. She was never cruel to Catherine. She even helped arrange for the couple to spend time together, because France needed heirs and that meant Henri had to sleep with his wife occasionally. It's such a strange, cold arrangement, but that was the world they lived in. Diane dined well but not excessively. She believed in moderation. Grilled meats, fish, vegetables, fruit. She drank wine mixed with water. She avoided heavy sauces and rich desserts. This was part of how she maintained her looks, her vitality. In the afternoons, she might inspect her properties. She owned the Château de Chenonceau, one of the most beautiful chateaux in France, built over a river. She oversaw its expansion, its decoration. She had gardens planted, galleries built. She had exquisite taste, and the chateau reflects that. Walking through those gardens, I imagine her footsteps slow and measured. Looking at the roses, the hedges trimmed into precise shapes. The smell of boxwood and lavender. The sound of the river flowing underneath the chateau, a constant murmur. She would return inside as the afternoon waned. She would change her gown, freshen up. Evening meant more time with the king, perhaps. Dining, conversation, music. The court was a stage, and everyone was always performing. You had to be witty but not too witty. Beautiful but not vain. Pious but not prudish. It was exhausting, frankly. Diane managed it for years. She was the king's official mistress until his death in 1559. He died from an injury sustained in a jousting tournament. A splinter from a lance pierced his eye and went into his brain. He suffered for days before finally dying. Catherine de' Medici wasted no time. She reclaimed her position. She took back the jewels Henri had given Diane. She forced Diane to exchange Chenonceau for a different chateau. Diane retreated from court and lived the rest of her life quietly, in the countryside. And maybe that was a relief. After decades of performing, of maintaining her position through beauty and wit and careful management, maybe it was nice to just be herself. To wake up without worrying about what gown to wear to impress the king. To eat what she wanted. To ride when she felt like it, not because it was part of her beauty regimen. She died in her 60s, which was a good long life for that era. And when her tomb was excavated centuries later, scientists found that her hair was still blonde, still beautiful. Even in death, she was lovely. Let me tell you about a queen who was pious and good and died young. Blanche of Castile. She was the mother of Louis IX of France, St. Louis. She married young, had 12 children though only 5 survived to adulthood. She was deeply religious, attending Mass multiple times a day, praying for hours. When her husband died, Blanche became regent for her young son. She ruled France for years, putting down rebellions, negotiating treaties, managing the kingdom's finances. She was effective and strict and not particularly well liked, but she got the job done. Her daily life was shaped by her faith. She woke before dawn to pray. The chapel was cold and dark, lit only by candles. She would kneel on the stone floor, her breath misting in the air, and she would pray. Long, fervent prayers. Thanking God for his blessings. Begging for guidance. Confessing her sins, though she tried very hard not to sin. After prayers, she would attend to business. Even as a regent, there was endless business. Letters from provincial governors. Requests from nobles. Complaints from bishops. The machinery of government never stopped. Blanche was strict with her children, especially Louis. She wanted him to be a good king, a pious king. She monitored his education closely. She chose his tutors. She made sure he spent hours every day in prayer and study. She didn't want him to be frivolous or vain or cruel. She wanted him to be a saint. And remarkably, she succeeded. Louis IX was canonized after his death, one of the few kings to achieve sainthood. But what did that strictness cost? Louis loved his wife, Margaret of Provence, but Blanche was jealous of their relationship. She would interrupt them whenever they were alone together. She would summon Louis away on some pretext. Margaret learned to put guards at the doors to warn her when Blanche was coming, so she and Louis could at least have a few moments together. It's a sad picture, isn't it? A mother so controlling, so fearful of losing influence, that she couldn't let her son have privacy with his own wife. And yet, Blanche probably thought she was doing the right thing. She was protecting him, guiding him, keeping him on the path of righteousness. She ate sparingly. Rich foods were seen as sinful, indulgent. She had simple meals: bread, vegetables, a little fish. She drank watered wine. She fasted frequently, more than was required by the church. Fasting was a form of discipline, a way to control the body, to focus the mind on spiritual matters. Blanche wore simple gowns, dark colors. She didn't adorn herself with jewels. She thought vanity was sinful. Her chambers were austere. A bed, a chest for her clothes, a prie-dieu for praying. No tapestries, no decorations. Just stone walls and a crucifix. She embroidered, but only religious items. Altar cloths. Vestments for priests. Banners for churches. Every stitch was a prayer. Every completed piece was an offering to God. In the evenings, she would pray again. Vespers and Compline. The chapel was even darker now, the candles flickering. The priest's voice intoning the Latin prayers. Blanche's voice joining in, steady and sure. She died after a long illness, having taken religious vows near the end. She spent her final days in a convent, surrounded by nuns, praying constantly. She died as she had lived, focused entirely on God and duty. It's a life that seems harsh to us now, all that self-denial, all that control. But Blanche probably felt it was the only way to live. The only way to ensure her soul's salvation and her son's success. Let me tell you about a different kind of woman. A woman who was both queen and warrior. Margaret of Anjou. She married Henry VI of England, and it turned out to be one of the most turbulent marriages in English history. Henry was pious and gentle and not very good at being king. He suffered from bouts of mental illness, similar to Charles VI of France. When Henry was incapacitated, Margaret stepped in. But unlike Isabeau, who had tried to rule as regent, Margaret went further. She raised armies. She led troops. She fought to protect her husband's throne and her son's inheritance. Imagine her, this French princess, riding at the head of an army. She would have worn armor, probably. Not full plate, that would be too heavy, but a breastplate at least. A helmet. She would have carried a sword, though whether she actually fought hand to hand is unclear. Probably she stayed back, directing strategy. But even that was shocking. Women didn't do this. Women didn't lead armies. But Margaret did what she had to do. Her daily life during the Wars of the Roses was chaos. She was constantly moving, fleeing from enemies, gathering new supporters, planning the next battle. She slept in castles, in monasteries, in tents. She ate whatever was available. Bread and cheese if she was lucky. Dried meat. Ale that tasted of the barrel. She would wake to the sound of camp breaking. Men shouting. Horses neighing. The clank of armor and weapons. She would dress quickly, with minimal help. No time for elaborate hairstyles or fine gowns. Just practical clothing. A riding dress, a cloak. She would consult with her commanders. Where is the enemy? How many men do we have? What are our supplies like? These were life and death questions. A wrong decision could mean defeat, capture, execution. She would ride for hours, sometimes days. The roads were rough, muddy in winter, dusty in summer. The landscape passed by slowly. Villages. Fields. Forests. England was beautiful, but Margaret probably barely noticed. She was too focused on survival. When there was time, she would write letters. Begging for support. Promising rewards to those who would join her cause. Threatening those who opposed her. Her handwriting was neat and careful, even when she must have been exhausted, even when her hand must have been cramping from cold. She fought for years. She won battles and lost battles. She saw men die, including friends and allies. She saw her cause falter and rally and falter again. In the end, she lost. Her husband was deposed and murdered. Her son was killed in battle. Margaret was captured and held prisoner for years before being ransomed back to France. She lived the rest of her life in France, in poverty. The fierce warrior queen reduced to living on a small pension in a modest house. She who had commanded armies now commanded nothing. But she endured. She woke each day. She attended mass. She did her embroidery. She wrote letters to old friends, reminiscing about better times. She lived quietly, and then she died, and most of England forgot about her. History remembered her, though, as a she-wolf, a harridan, an unnatural woman. But also as a mother fighting for her child. A wife defending her husband. A woman who refused to give up even when any reasonable person would have. Let me tell you now about a quieter woman. A woman who lived in the shadows and seemed content there. Jane Shore. She was the mistress of King Edward IV of England, and unlike some of the other mistresses we've talked about, she never sought power or wealth. She just seemed to enjoy the king's company, and he enjoyed hers. Jane was married to a merchant when Edward noticed her. He pursued her, and eventually she left her husband for him. This was scandalous, but Edward was charming and handsome and king. Jane probably felt she had no choice, and maybe she didn't want one. She lived in rooms near the palace. Comfortable rooms, but not ostentatious. Edward gave her gifts, but she often gave them away to people in need. She had a reputation for kindness, for interceding with the king on behalf of people who needed pardons or help. Her days were gentle. She woke late, usually. Edward would visit her in the mornings sometimes, if he had time. They would talk, laugh. He found her restful, apparently. She was witty but not demanding. Pretty but not vain. Jane would spend her mornings reading or sewing. She had a small household, just a few servants. A maid, a cook, a groom. She didn't need much. She wasn't trying to build an empire or establish a dynasty. She was just living her life. She would walk in the gardens. London had gardens then, enclosed spaces where you could escape the noise and smell of the city. She would walk slowly, enjoying the flowers, the birdsong. Maybe she would sit on a bench and just breathe for a while. She dined simply. She didn't have elaborate feasts. Just good, simple food. Roasted chicken. Fresh bread. Vegetables from the garden. Fruit. Wine. She ate alone, mostly, or with one or two friends. In the afternoons, she might visit the poor. She would bring food, money, clothes. She would sit with sick people, comfort them. This wasn't just performative charity. She genuinely seemed to care. When Edward died suddenly, Jane's world collapsed. The new king, Edward's brother Richard III, was hostile to everyone associated with Edward's reign. Jane was arrested and charged with various crimes, including witchcraft and adultery. The charges were absurd, but that didn't matter. She was forced to do public penance. She had to walk through the streets of London in her undergarments, barefoot, carrying a candle. This was meant to humiliate her, to punish her for her sexual sins. But the people of London loved Jane. Instead of mocking her, they pitied her. They threw flowers in her path. They wept. The punishment backfired. Jane was released eventually, and she lived a long life. She married twice more, both times to men of modest means. She died in poverty, in old age, but apparently in peace. Her story is a gentle one, in the end. She wasn't a great political figure. She didn't change history. She was just a kind woman who happened to catch a king's eye, and who handled her position with grace and generosity. Let me tell you about a woman who was anything but gentle. Isabella of France, sometimes called the she-wolf of France. She was the wife of Edward II of England, and she hated him. Edward was a weak king, more interested in his male favorites than in his wife or his kingdom. He lavished gifts and titles on these favorites, particularly Piers Gaveston and later Hugh Despenser. Isabella was sidelined, ignored, sometimes actively humiliated. She endured this for years. She bore Edward 4 children. She maintained the appearance of a dutiful wife. But inside, she was planning. She traveled to France on a diplomatic mission, and once there, she refused to return. She took a lover, Roger Mortimer. Together, they raised an army and invaded England. The invasion was swift and successful. Edward's support crumbled. He was captured and forced to abdicate in favor of his son. Isabella and Mortimer ruled as regents. But then, Edward had to be dealt with. He was imprisoned in Berkeley Castle, and a few months later, he was dead. The official story was that he died of natural causes. The rumor was that he was murdered, in a particularly gruesome way. Isabella lived another 30 years. Her son, Edward III, eventually took power and arrested Mortimer, who was executed. But Isabella was spared. She was sent to live in comfortable retirement. What were those years like for her? She lived in castles, in manor houses. She had a generous allowance. She could do as she pleased, more or less, as long as she stayed out of politics. She woke in comfortable beds. She dressed in fine gowns. She attended Mass, always Mass. She was pious, or at least she performed piety well. She endowed monasteries and churches. She gave to charity. She embroidered. She read. She walked in gardens. She visited her grandchildren occasionally. She watched them grow up, marry, have children of their own. Did she think about Edward? Did she regret what she had done, or did she feel it was justified? We'll never know. She kept her thoughts to herself. She died in her 60s and was buried in her wedding dress, wearing on her breast Edward's heart in a silver casket. This detail is so strange, so haunting. Did she love him once, before everything went wrong? Or was this a final performance, a way to rehabilitate her image? History called her a she-wolf, a murderess. But she was also a woman who endured years of humiliation and neglect. Who fought back in the only way she could. Who won and then lived with the consequences for decades. Let me tell you about a woman whose life was defined by waiting. Catherine of Aragon. She came to England as a teenage bride, married to Prince Arthur, Henry VIII's older brother. Arthur died just months after the wedding. Catherine was a widow at 16. And then she waited. For 7 years, she waited in England, in limbo. Was she Arthur's widow, or could she marry Henry, the new heir? It was a legal and theological question, and while it was being debated, Catherine lived in near poverty, her allowance always late, her status unclear. She lived in cold, drafty houses. She pawned her jewelry to pay her servants. She wrote letter after letter to her father, the King of Spain, begging for help, for guidance, for money. The letters are heartbreaking. You can feel her loneliness, her desperation. But she maintained her dignity. She attended Mass. She said her prayers. She studied English. She waited. Finally, when Henry became king, he married her. For 20 years, she was queen. She bore 6 children, though only one, Mary, survived infancy. She was popular with the people. She was pious and charitable and dignified. And then Henry wanted an annulment. He had fallen in love with Anne Boleyn. He needed a male heir. Catherine was too old to have more children. He wanted to be free. Catherine refused. She said her marriage was valid, blessed by God and the Church. She would not accept an annulment. So Henry broke with the Catholic Church. He declared himself head of the Church of England. He had his marriage annulled anyway. Catherine was no longer queen. She was the Dowager Princess of Wales, Arthur's widow, nothing more. She was sent away from court. She lived in increasingly small and uncomfortable houses. She was forbidden from seeing her daughter. Her health declined. Her days became even quieter. She woke in cold rooms. She dressed with the help of just 1 or 2 loyal servants. She attended Mass in small private chapels. She prayed for hours. She embroidered. She wrote letters, though many were intercepted and never sent. She ate little. Some say she stopped eating properly, that she essentially starved herself. Others say she was poisoned. We don't know. She died in January 1536, in a small manor house, with just a few faithful servants by her side. She was 50 years old. She had spent her whole adult life in England, and yet she died essentially alone, separated from her daughter, rejected by the man she considered her husband. On her deathbed, she wrote one final letter to Henry. It's beautiful and sad. She forgave him. She said she loved him. She asked him to be good to their daughter. And then she died. She was buried quietly. No state funeral. No great mourning. Just a simple service and a grave. But Catherine never gave up. Even at the end, she insisted she was the true queen. She signed her letters Catherine the Queen. She wore her wedding ring. She refused to accept the reality that Henry tried to force on her. There's something admirable in that stubbornness, that refusal to bend. But there's also something deeply sad. She spent so many years waiting and fighting, and in the end, she lost anyway. Let me tell you about the woman who replaced her. Anne Boleyn. Everyone knows Anne's story, or thinks they do. The seductress who ensnared a king. The witch. The adulteress who was executed. But before all that, Anne was just a girl. She grew up in England and France, educated, witty, charming. She returned to the English court as a lady-in-waiting to Queen Catherine. She had dark hair and dark eyes and a sharp tongue. She was not conventionally beautiful, but she was fascinating. Henry noticed her. He pursued her. But Anne was smart. She didn't become his mistress. She held out for marriage. For 7 years, Henry tried to get his annulment so he could marry Anne. 7 years. What was Anne's life like during those years? She was at court, part of the Queen's household, and yet everyone knew the king wanted her. It must have been intensely uncomfortable. Catherine hated her, understandably. The other ladies whispered about her. But Anne endured. She woke in rooms at the palace. She dressed carefully, beautifully. She wore French fashions, which were more daring than English ones. She wore her hair loose sometimes, which was scandalous for a woman her age. She wore the letter B on a pendant around her neck. B for Berlin. She attended Mass. She read religious texts, particularly reform-minded ones. Anne was sympathetic to the Protestant Reformation. She owned books that were banned in England. She and Henry would discuss theology, religion, the state of the church. This was part of her appeal. She could talk to him about ideas, not just court gossip. She waited. For 7 years, she waited. And finally, Henry broke with Rome. He married Anne in secret. She was crowned queen. For 3 years, she was queen. She had a daughter, Elizabeth. She had miscarriages. She failed to produce a son, and Henry's love turned to frustration, then to hatred. Anne's daily life as queen was exhausting. She had to maintain her position through wit and charm, because her political support was weak. She made enemies easily. She was too sharp, too outspoken. She didn't suffer fools. She woke and dressed in elaborate gowns. She attended Mass. She presided over the court. She entertained ambassadors. She argued with Henry, which was dangerous. Queens were supposed to be submissive, agreeable. Anne was neither. She read. She patronized artists and musicians. She advocated for religious reform. She tried to position herself as more than just a wife, as a political and spiritual force. But Henry had already noticed Jane Seymour, her lady-in-waiting. Quiet, submissive Jane. The opposite of Anne in every way. Anne was arrested on charges of adultery, incest, and treason. The charges were almost certainly false. But Henry wanted her gone, and what the king wanted, he got. She spent her final days in the Tower of London. The same rooms where she had stayed before her coronation, when she was full of hope and triumph. Now she was a prisoner waiting to die. What did she do in those final days? She prayed. She talked to the women who were assigned to watch her. She joked, sometimes, inappropriate jokes that shocked her attendants. She was terrified but trying not to show it. She was executed on a May morning. She She wore a grey damask gown and a red petticoat. She made a brief speech, saying nothing against the king. And then the swordsman from France, specially brought over because he was supposed to be the best, cut off her head with one stroke. She was 35 years old. She had been queen for 3 years. Her daughter would become the greatest monarch England ever had, but Anne didn't know that. She died thinking she had failed. Let me tell you about the woman who came next. Jane Seymour. Quiet Jane. Pale Jane. Jane who gave Henry his son and died doing it. Jane was a lady-in-waiting, first to Catherine and then to Anne. She watched both of them fall. She learned. When Henry noticed her, she was careful. She was modest. She refused his gifts unless he married her. She presented herself as the anti-Anne. Submissive. Gentle. Traditional. Henry married her 11 days after Anne's execution. 11 days. Jane's time as queen was short, just over a year. She spent most of it pregnant. She had finally conceived the male heir that Henry so desperately wanted. Her daily life was quiet. She woke and dressed in simple gowns, no French fashions. She wore her hair covered, properly. She attended Mass. She was pious, or at least she performed piety well. She reconciled Henry with his daughter Mary, Catherine's daughter. This was brave of her. Anne had hated Mary, and Henry had been estranged from her. But Jane gently encouraged reconciliation. It worked. Mary was brought back to court. Jane embroidered. She read devotional texts. She walked in the gardens. She rested, because pregnancy was exhausting and dangerous. When her time came, the labor was long and difficult. 3 days. She finally gave birth to a son, Edward. The kingdom rejoiced. Henry was ecstatic. He finally had his heir. But Jane developed an infection. Puerperal fever, probably. She lingered for days, feverish, in pain. And then she died. Henry genuinely mourned her. Of all his wives, she was the only one he asked to be buried beside. She had given him what he wanted most, and it had killed her. Jane's story is a sad one. She was queen for such a short time. She's remembered mainly for dying in childbirth, for being the wife Henry loved most because she didn't live long enough to disappoint him. But in her brief time, she tried to be kind. She tried to heal rifts. She tried to be a good queen. And then she died, and another woman took her place. Let me tell you about a queen who survived. Catherine Parr. She was Henry's 6th and last wife, and she outlived him. Catherine was a widow twice over when Henry married her. She was educated, intelligent, interested in religion and scholarship. She was also in love with someone else, Thomas Seymour, but when the king proposed, she couldn't refuse. She was queen for 4 years. By this time, Henry was old, sick, obese. His leg ulcers stank. He was in constant pain. He was often in foul moods. Catherine's daily life revolved around caring for him. She would sit with him for hours. She would read to him. She would oversee his medical care, his meals. She soothed him when he was angry. She distracted him when he was in pain. She also cared for his children. She brought Mary and Elizabeth and Edward together, created a family unit. She oversaw their education. She was kind to them, genuinely kind. Catherine woke early. She prayed. She studied. She was writing a book, a religious work. She was the first woman in England to publish a book under her own name in English. This was groundbreaking. She attended Mass. She managed the household. She dealt with the endless politics of court. She walked a careful line, advocating for religious reform without angering conservatives too much. She argued with Henry about religion once, and it nearly got her arrested. Someone warned her, and she quickly recanted, played the submissive wife. Henry forgave her. She had learned what Anne never did, when to back down. When Henry died, Catherine was free. She was wealthy. She was still young, in her 30s. She married Thomas Seymour almost immediately, the man she had loved before. For a brief time, she was happy. She was pregnant for the first time in her life. She was in love. She had her own household, her own life. But childbirth killed her, as it had killed Jane Seymour. She developed a fever after giving birth to a daughter. She died a few days later. Her final words were confused, feverish. She said those around her wanted her dead. She was probably delirious. Or maybe she knew that Seymour had already betrayed her, flirting with the young Princess Elizabeth under Catherine's own roof. She died, and Seymour remarried quickly. Catherine was buried quietly. And the world moved on. The sun is setting now, in our imaginations. The light is fading. These women, these queens and mistresses, they're fading too, back into history. Back into the quiet places where they lived and died. They woke in cold rooms. They dressed in layers of wool and silk. They attended endless masses. They embroidered. They managed households. They bore children, so many children, and watched too many of them die. They navigated politics and intrigue. They tried to survive in a world that was often hostile to women, especially women with power. Some of them were kind. Some were cruel. Most were probably a bit of both, like all of us. They did what they had to do to survive, to protect their children, to maintain their positions. They made choices, sometimes good, sometimes terrible. And when their time was over, they died. In childbed, in exile, on the scaffold, in quiet retirement. They died, and other women took their places. The cycle continued. But tonight, we've remembered them. We've walked through their days, felt the cold of their chambers, smelled the incense in their chapels, heard the whisper of their gowns on stone floors. We've kept them company for a little while. And now, it's time for you to sleep. You've been so patient, listening to all these stories. But you're tired now. Your eyes are heavy. Your body is sinking into the bed, relaxed and warm. The women of the past are sleeping too. Their struggles are over. Their worries have faded. They're at peace, and so can you be. Let yourself drift now. Let these stories carry you into sleep. Dream of candlelit chambers and gardens and the slow turning of the seasons. Dream of quiet lives lived long ago. You're safe. You're comfortable. Everything is well. Sleep now. Sleep deeply. Good night, dear ones. Good night.